All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, What SMEs Should Consider When Purchasing an SD-WAN. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You guys are welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be sure to go over all questions at the end of the webinar. Most importantly, there will be a recording of this webcast available to you within a couple of days. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dave Greenfield and Steve Garcon. Dave is a veteran of IT industry. He spent more than 20 years as an award-winning journalist and independent technology consultant. Today he serves as a secure networking evangelist for Cato Networks. And Steve Garcon brings more than a decade of experience helping global enterprises design, source, and implement wide area networks, WANs, with all major SD-WAN providers, MPLS services, and telcos. Before we get started, we're going to run a quick poll just to get better acquainted. And here we go. All right. What do you think is the primary characteristic that SMEs should consider when evaluating SD-WANs? You can start answering now. All right, it looks like we're getting some good answers here. We're going to give it just a couple more seconds. Okay. All right, it looks like 43% of you are saying security, 39% say performance, 5% say global coverage, 9% say simplicity, and 5% say advanced functionality. All right, thank you guys. And Dave, if you could get us started, that would be great.
Super. Well, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you all for joining us today. Those numbers I thought were really interesting. Having been in networking for so long and seeing the development of SD-WANs, because, while we are interested in advanced functionality, we are interested in security. Really, when you look at an SD-WAN, the premise of an SD-WAN was that it was going to solve the challenges that were created by MPLS, or rather created by the shift to the internet and some other dynamics that MPLS was ill-suited for. We wanted to keep MPLS's benefits, but most of all, we really wanted to make things simple, right? SD-WANs were supposed to make things a lot easier for us. And it was a theme that came up when Steve and I were talking, the importance of simplicity. I think it's a thing that we'll see or hear a lot more when Steve speaks. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Steve. And why don't you walk us through the challenges that MPLS faced and how we got to SD-WANs?
Sure, Dave. Good to be here. Like you said, there's a lot to understand relative to the challenges that drove SD-WAN, and we're going to look at some of those. Might be a refresher for those of you who know about SD-WANs, but just bear with us. We'll keep it tight and short. With MPLS, our sites were typically configured in a hub and spoke topology. Branches communicated with the hub in the data center. Internet access was typically centralized, and cloud internet went through the headquarters. And MPLS gave us predictability, availability, but we suffered from other problems. Backhauling internet traffic to the data center for security consumed a lot of expensive MPLS bandwidth, and it often meant added latency, as we know.
That was the tromboning effect, wasn't it, Steve?
That's the trombone effect, exactly. Exactly. Especially if you're a musician, you know all about that. So you've got some challenges. You got the expense of MPLS, long time to deploy. It can take 60, 90, 120 days. Some parts of the world, it can take 6 months to get an MPLS circuit installed.
Wow.
This kind of topology doesn't really address the concerns of cloud and mobile access, and also security and management, are very complex. So these are things that aren't currently addressed with the traditional WAN. So we want to address those with SD-WAN. And with SD-WAN, we built an encrypted overlay of VPN tunnels across our underlying data services. It doesn't matter whether it's MPLS, broadband, internet, LTE, point-to-points, it doesn't matter. And these encrypted overlays are like VLANs, essentially. In fact, you could use your VLANs over this network. And we configure policies, and the policies are configured in the controller, and these policies relate to all of the applications running on your network and what's considered acceptable latency and packet loss in the case of voice jitter. And all these policies are sent from the controller to each of the SD-WAN nodes. And the SD-WAN nodes collect the latency and loss information from all the various connections, and it uses that data to decide which is the right circuit to send the application traffic.
So
and
Steve,
yeah,
we've really separated now the underlying WAN from the application. Right before, the application really ran on MPLS or whatever the underlying transport is. Now it's really has the software layer, this overlay that's sitting in between them, and I guess that gives us a lot more flexibility and lets us take advantage of low-cost internet lines and all that kind of good stuff.
It sure does, and in fact, you could use multiple internet lines. You can get better than five nines of stability on your network with multiple connections.
Wow, I think we'll touch on that a bit later. Yeah, great.
So one of the challenges, as we know, with MPLS is the long time to deploy a network. And to address provisioning, the SD-WANs use what's called zero-touch provisioning, and this is a function that allows you to, take a box, take an SD-WAN node, and ship it to a remote office. You don't need an engineer to configure it because, remember, your configuration is done in the controller. It doesn't matter where that box is being sent. Person plugs it in. It gets an IP address from the internet provider, and then it's able to communicate with the controller. It downloads the configuration, and it's ready to operate.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, Steve, that's pretty interesting, and that's a big change for MPLS, right? Because instead of having to wait for my MPLS provider now for one, provision a new line, which you said could take, what, 60, 90, 120 days, and instead of having to get my equipment out and send an engineer out on site, I can now just drop ship an SD-WAN node and get any kind of internet line, and in theory, I'm up and running. I just wonder, is ZTP as easy as it sounds? Does it make SD-WANs as easy as it sounds? And are there any kinds of edge cases, kind of unusual instances, perhaps, where people should be thinking about, looking at, that might pose a challenge for ZTP in some instances?
Yeah, there are some challenges. Sometimes a local ISP does not have additional DHCP addresses that can be given, and in that case you have to manually configure it, but that's part of the planning stage. That can be done before the device is shipped. But also when you're looking at edge cases for your physical offices, you want to pay attention to how do you handle cloud deployments in AWS. This is a big challenge for some of the SD-WAN providers, and you have to pay attention to that when you're considering what kind of solution you're going to be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And another case to consider on the edge case is, as I said, the cloud apps, AWS, and also, are you going to be using a firewall or other edge device? Can this be incorporated into the SD-WAN? Some companies are going to want to have use their own firewall for VPN access, and that's got to be taken into account when selecting the right SD-WAN solution. And then there's a question of mobile workers and IoT devices. Again, this is an area that isn't addressed by many SD-WAN providers. So really, you just have to think beyond the offices. And usually you'll find the biggest differences between vendors in terms of deployment when you're looking at the edge case.
Okay, super. Why don't we talk about performance for a moment? The SD-WANs made their name on turning the internet into enterprise backbones. Can the internet really be an enterprise backbone?
That's a good point, Dave. the internet could be an internet backbone, but it all depends on where you're looking. This slide shows some data that I collected over a 2-week period with a client in California. Their data centers in California, and we monitored the traffic all over the world for all their locations, and we compared their current MPLS network to the internet. And in this particular case, it was pretty remarkable that the internet performed better than their very expensive MPLS connection. If anyone has facilities in Mexico, they know what it could cost. And so we looked at that and we said, if you used SD-WAN, you could reduce your reliance on MPLS here and actually get better performance. Now, is this the case everywhere? No, it's not the case everywhere, but this is part of the preparation process and sampling data and knowing what the performance is in the different region you're looking at. And SD-WANs, some SD-WANs have forward error correction and TCP optimization, which also helps local internet performance. So to use the internet, you need to pay attention to your network, your locations, and what's available in region.
Yeah, in region, that's a great point. I was speaking with one of our customers, and interesting story. They had a headquarters over in I think it was in Toronto. They had some offices and scattered around the U.S. And it turns out that even though they weren't going out of region, they were staying within North America because of the nature of internet routing. Latency from I think it was Pittsburgh to Toronto was horrendous. It was
probably
just
went through Chicago or some out-of-the-way route like that.
Chicago isn't so out of the way. I actually think it was going out to Florida, then bouncing back up. But the point is that internet routing is so unpredictable, right? It can perform really well at one point in time, and it may even perform well 90% of the time. But if you're used to MPLS predictability, you're not going to get that, right? You're not going to get those that kind of consistency. But I think international routes, you have a lot of experience in, I know in India and other places like that. Why don't you give us a view, from there and that kind of perspective?
Yeah, sure. So this graph that's on the screen right now is some data that we sampled for a company that has a data center in Texas and a number of facilities in India. And they were complaining about the difficulty of operations. They were using a VPN over the internet, and sometimes, basically people couldn't do anything. And we set up our monitoring tools, and we monitor the traffic, and we saw, enormous spikes of latency and packet loss. And this just shows an example in this graph. Bangalore packet loss would rise to 6% at times, and actually sometimes even higher than that. And then the other city, it was not unusual to see packet loss numbers jumping to 15%. And this is a perfect example of how running a VPN over the internet would probably not be a dependable way to run a network. And this is where a WAN consultant can really help you with this kind of example to find out what is the dependability of the internet for each of the locations to the path you're trying to reach.
Okay. So, one of the interesting things, oh, great, this is a great slide. I'm going to shut up here, Steve, and I'll let you do the talking.
Oh, come on. So here's another example. This is a client that has 4 locations in Japan, and originally they had an MPLS node in each of those 4 locations so they can have dependable access to their data center in California. And again, we did sampling of their MPLS traffic and their internet traffic, and what we saw is that over the internet they could have a mesh of VPNs and have very dependable traffic and get rid of 3 of their MPLS connections and essentially have the same or better connectivity to their data center. So by having a mesh with SD-WAN in the 4 different locations, they all share that same MPLS network, and then there's a failover over an internet VPN there. If a company had more rigorous failover requirements, they might have 2 locations with MPLS, but it's a financial decision, and it's been very stable, and they're very happy.
Mm-hmm. Super.
Great.
So, yeah.
So brownouts and blackouts, are an issue that people have to pay attention to, and people wonder, well, how can I get 5 nines of uptime with internet? And the way that's done is with multiple links.
You had a blog about this recently, didn't you? Where you
Yes.
provided a formula that showed how availability could be calculated on with multiple links.
Exactly. Basically, there's a formula that you can use. Even if you know that a broadband link, might only have 99% availability, by aggregating multiple links, you can actually reach your 5 nines. Join it with an MPLS network, and you need less internet links. But the key is the active-active load balancing and fast session failover, and the ability for an SD-WAN provider to detect blackouts and brownouts. When latency increases, when packet loss increases, that circuit may be live, but it may not be effective, and the SD-WAN will decide that it shouldn't use that particular path until the performance improves.
So it should be able to fail over to an alternative path. That's where the active-active comes in, right? You should, you're constantly load balancing based on the application policies you've configured between the two lines. If there's a failure or a partial failure, you mentioned an increase in loss or latency, then the SD-WAN node will fail over to the backup line and then fail back, I imagine, when the line becomes active again.
Exactly.
And I guess you have fast session failover here. How fast is fast? A second? Half a second?
I don't think a second is fast enough, and some of the SD-WAN companies have a 30-second failover.
Right.
I think looking at 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds. The key is fast enough to maintain a session, especially, which is of primary importance if you're using VoIP or video. You don't want to have to make a new connection, especially if you're a call center. That
Right.
just wouldn't go over very well.
No, it wouldn't at all.
So let's talk about security a little bit. Advanced security. I'm sorry, Dave.
Steve, before we get to security, I know it's being from Cato, we happen to love security, but before we move there, why don't you just recap for us for a moment? You talk about the internet as a backbone. You talked about the performance of the internet and the availability of the internet. If you had to name, I don't know, 3 or 4 features that folks could take with them as they walked out of here, and include it in their RFPs, which of those features would be?
As far as just general SD-WAN features?
Well, specifically as far as SD-WAN backbone performance is concerned or availability is concerned.
Okay, availability, the ability to provide a rapid failover.
Okay.
If your company has an area like a global network that's in some areas where internet performance over the backbone may not be satisfactory, does that SD-WAN provider have their own backbone that can be used to assure reliability across the globe? And security is an important factor.
I've heard this before, why, in your opinion, why is security so important to SD-WANs?
Well, security is important. First of all, in the SME marketplace, security is expensive. Security takes a lot of hardware, takes a lot of software. You have to pay attention to regular upgrades. It takes skill. It takes monitoring. It's a complex thing to offer, and all you need is to have one major security breach, and you're in a lot of trouble.
Right.
There's a local pharmaceutical company that had a malware breakout, and it completely crushed their network for over 24 hours, and it was catastrophic. They had to go through every single desktop in the company and clean it. It was not a trivial matter at all, and I witnessed that a couple of years ago, and it really opened my eyes to the reality of security, because you read about these things, but you don't actually witness them yourself.
Right. Hopefully not, at least.
Yeah, exactly.
But we've had those issues beforehand. I mean, what is it about? Why is security so important to an SD-WAN?
Well, security security on SD-WAN is offered, through a variety of functions. One of which is the virtual overlays. For instance, you have guest Wi-Fi in a company. You want people to use guest Wi-Fi to access the internet and not see anything else that's on your corporate network. So through segmentation of that traffic, you're going to provide that kind of security. With credit card transactions, if you're in the retail space, same thing. You've got PCI compliance issues. You want to keep all of that credit card transaction traffic completely separate from all your other corporate data flows.
Kind of like a VLAN on a WAN.
It's exactly the case. I mean, again, it's a perfect analogy. Your virtual tunnels are like VLANs operating over your network. But the SD-WANs typically just provide edge protection. Okay, there's a firewall for the edge. It's not a sophisticated firewall where you can have many layers of programmability of the firewall. That's something that most SD-WANs don't do today. And
actually, my impression is if you look at the ONUG document as they defined SD-WANs initially, so going back a couple of years, and I think a lot of people followed this. SD-WANs seem to provide encryption and layer 2 access control, right? But that's about it, right? They're not really, you mentioned firewalling. Firewalling is somewhat offered, but it's very elementary, and it's really not. It's not offered by everybody. It's really not sufficient, isn't it?
No, and I'm a big believer that everybody really has to pay attention to the full security stack, and not just have a firewall and consider that's adequate. So it's important to integrate security into an SD-WAN, and SD-WANs have functionality that will permit that. But the way they are today, malware, application layer attacks, they're just not addressed.
Right, and it's a good point. I mean, we hear great service insertion and service chaining, but even with service insertion and service chaining, which allows you to introduce the security service into SD-WAN, it's two separate domains, isn't it? And it's still, you have your security domain you need to manage, and you have your SD-WAN domain you have to manage, and it's two separate consoles, separate policies have to be created. Everything is separate, which makes things just a little bit more complicated.
Exactly, and that's and I've been to security seminars with security officers from major companies, and the common thread they all have is we don't have the resources to do this right. Everybody's doing their best, but they just don't have the resources to do it right.
So walk us through here. What are we looking at here? And why don't you explain how insertion and chaining works?
Sure. Okay. In service insertion, service chaining, service insertion allows you to insert some type of software or hardware function into the data stream. And service chaining allows you to basically have a chain or a series of different services that are inserted into the traffic flow. And if you look at this particular diagram, what you have is the traffic from an office going to the internet over the SD-WAN, and from the SD-WAN node on the far right side, it goes into the data center where the firewall, intrusion protection, and other parts of the security stack goes over the traffic and make sure it's safe, and then it goes out to the internet from that point. So that's, whoops, sorry about that.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. So that's essentially the way security chaining, service chaining, and service insertion works. But it's really something that's important to do, but you have to know how to do it. And using an SD-WAN, you can use an outside security service, or if you have a SD-WAN provider that has security service included as part of it, then you don't need the service chaining ability because it's part of their service, and that makes things a lot easier.
It sounds like if you're an SME and you're looking at essential features for your SD-WAN RFP that you're looking at putting together, it sounds like what you're saying is that service insertion, service chaining might be a nice to have. Probably not critical if you're an SME if the company's already providing security in the SD-WAN itself.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Why don't you advance this one slide here? And
yeah,
I'm
I
going
think this is a perfect segue for you.
Super. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take over here, just run us through a couple, and then I'll return it back to Steve. It's it really is that integration of security and networking that was so important to Cato when we built out our SD-WAN solution. If you look on the bottom of your screen, you've got your data center connected via two internet connections as well as MPLS. You've got your branch on the right side. Also connected in the same configuration, and both branch and data center are connected into into the Cato cloud. Next screen, please. Steve, you want to give me a click there? Thanks, Steve. And by bringing traffic into the Cato cloud, we're able to provide the kinds of optimizations you'd want to see, both not just at the network layer, so TCP optimization and things of that sort, but also at the security layer. So you no longer have to go out and buy a firewall. You no longer have to go out and buy a secure web gateway or next generation firewall. All that functionality now is built in to the Cato cloud, and it becomes an intrinsic part of the Cato SD-WAN service. Next slide, please. And what that means is that as you not just connect your sites, but as you connect your mobile users, for example, or your cloud locations, really, as any resource connects into the Cato cloud, they inherit those features and functions. So they inherit those security and network optimization functions as well. All right, Steve, I think I'm going to turn this over to you next. Yeah, there we go. So let's wrap up here with management and move on to our summary, then take a few more questions from the audience.
Okay, great. So, SD-WAN makes management easier, but the fact is SD-WAN management is still incredibly detailed. So you want to keep it simple. Many companies are going to prefer a managed solution unless you have an in-house network pro to manage it. And also when you're looking at SD-WAN features, there's a lot of things you don't need if you're an SME. For instance, you'll have a choice between hub and spoke and mesh architectures. If you don't have a mesh architecture in your network, there's no reason to look at that as a benefit. There are, as in any product that's sold, they might have lots of features, but if they're not important to you, they really shouldn't be part of the evaluation. WAN optimization is another feature that some offer. Unless you're transferring large files over high latency paths, let's say over 100 milliseconds, WAN optimization probably isn't of any value to you. Scalability. Some suppliers will talk about how we have customers with 5,000 locations installed on one network. If your company has 100 locations or 150, that probably isn't important either.
So Steve, let me interrupt you for 1 second. So those are the features you wouldn't look for if you're an SME, or some of the features you wouldn't look for if you're an SME. What are 3 features you would want if you were an SME?
Well, 3 features we would look for, and actually, if we go to the next slide, one of the key features is zero-touch provisioning. Ease of implementing your network. Another feature is traffic policies that will help determine how traffic should be routed across your network. Real-time and non-real-time applications. Consistent measuring of latency and packet loss and the ability to fail over in hundreds of milliseconds, not in many seconds or more. Those are key things to look at. As far as the number of connections that an SD-WAN supports, for the most part, 2 or 3 connections is adequate. Again, bragging about supporting 10 connections, nobody does that. It's just not important. Preserving a session state during failover. If you're doing voice or video, that's a really critical thing in the availability evaluation to look at. Then there's the performance issues. An SLA-backed backbone offers consistent long-haul performance. If you've got a long-haul network, that's a critical thing for you to look at. Hub and spoke architecture, as I mentioned earlier, is probably fine for most companies. and you want to be able to manage brownouts and blackouts. Nobody likes getting a call saying, why is network performance so bad? You want to basically disconnect a bad performing network leg so that everybody gets the service they deserve and isn't complaining about performance. On the security side, you want to be looking at encryption and the ability to segment your network. You want to be able to have breakouts for security and the ability to use cloud-based services if that's your preference. I personally think having an SD-WAN provider that provides the security is actually a really important thing to look at. And but if you want to use another service, then service insertion is going to be critical, and because that's how you're going to introduce security services into the SD-WAN. And of course, centralized management and the ability to see your entire network, the performance, all of the configurations from a single pane of glass. So that's really what you need to look at in an SD-WAN.
That's it, Steve?
That's it. Just those things.
Just those things.
Yeah. Exactly.
Super. So, yeah, great. Well, hey, thank you. I really appreciated you coming on board here with us and having this this chat about SD-WAN. So, it's always fun talking to you. I
just want to put in a quick plug. We have a free SD Win Jumpstart Kit that you can find at our website. It usually sells for $500, but using this coupon code, which you'll see on the form, CATO4, C-A-T-O 4, you'll be able to download that free of charge, and it'll give you about 30 pages of information on how to evaluate SD-WANs, and we'd be happy to talk to you offline if you'd like some assistance with that project.
30 pages. It sounds like they better ping you offline.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think we have some questions now.
Great. Well, thank you, folks. Yeah, and Bonnie, why don't we punt it over to you?
Absolutely. So before we head over to Q&A, let's just run this poll real quickly. Would you guys be interested in a free estimate of your networking and security cost reduction using Cato? You can start answering now. All right, we'll let that run and stay open for now, so if anybody hasn't answered, you can still go on and answer. Because we're running a little bit short on time, we have a couple questions we can get to. Steve, I think this first one would be great for you. The question is, when would you use the internet as your backbone?
I would use the internet as my backbone anywhere where there's a dependable internet infrastructure. I'll generalize and say United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea are all areas where you can count on having pretty dependable internet. So I'd have no hesitation using it there.
Okay, great. And another good one for you, Steve. How would I run a POC to evaluate SD-WANs?
Well, I would probably get a copy of our SD-WAN RFP, but it's really a complicated process. It is not a trivial process, and there are companies that spend a great deal of time and money running a POC only to find out that the POC doesn't do what they want. So using an expert can really help you with that process.
Okay, great. Dave, we have a good one for you. Where is Cato service actually available?
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. So I think we're up to about 30 POPs around the world today. It's changes all the time. All over North America, Asia Pac, and Europe come to mind. But if you ping us, we have a good POP map that'll answer that question really clearly.
Okay, great. And Dave, also, how would you compare Cato's SD-WAN with other SD-WANs currently in the market?
So do we have time for another webinar? You know, we have a lot of providers out there that I think that Gartner says that there are about 32 providers or so that claim to be delivering SD-WAN. What makes Cato particularly unique is our ability to address the full scope of enterprise backbone problems. So we're giving you not just a piece of SD-WAN equipment and forcing you to run over best effort over the internet or over MPLS as your only two choices, but we have the Cato Cloud, which is a managed SLA-backed backbone that gives you MPLS-like performance at internet-like prices. So that's a huge benefit. And on top of that, as we mentioned, we also integrate all of your security services. So no longer do you have to worry about deploying, a ton of appliances out to all your offices, all security appliances out to all of your office. All of that is baked into the cloud. There's a lot more we can talk about.
That's really big.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we're pretty excited about that. Pretty juiced.
All right. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time. There were a lot other questions asked, and we'll be sure to have somebody contact you guys directly to get those questions answered. And again, I would just like to thank both Dave and Steve for this great session. And everybody on here, you will receive a link to view this webinar and the recording within a couple of days. And we look forward to meeting you at our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.